I did not step into that boardroom holding a mop to clean spilled coffee. I was there to decide who would win the $80 million contract. When the CEO's wife pointed at the mess and said, "Scrub the floor," the room assumed I was just a janitor. They had no idea they had just publicly humiliated the exact person with the power to kill their deal right before closing. My name is Ella Gray, and I am 38 years old. I stood just inside the heavy glass doors of the 52nd floor boardroom in uptown Charlotte, letting the pressurized air of the North Briar Signal Systems headquarters cool the damp sweat on the back of my neck. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawled like a neat, compartmentalized circuit board. Inside the room, the atmosphere was suffocatingly rich, smelling of expensive cologne, catered pastries, and the premature arrogance of a closed deal. We were here to finalize an $80 million infrastructure contract for the Crown Bridge Civic Response Authority. It was the kind of money that made men in bespoke suits smile with too many teeth and speak in hushed, reverent tones. I did not fit the aesthetic of the room. I had just driven straight from a catastrophic field inspection at the Northern Relay Station. My dark technical utility jacket was still damp at the cuffs. The heavy tread of my steel-toed safety boots felt distinctly loud against the imported marble flooring of the reception area. Under my arm, I carried a thick printed binder of system diagnostics, the edges of the paper slightly warped from the humidity of a flooded subterranean server room. I looked exactly like what I was, a field operative, a woman who spent her mornings wading through ankle-deep water to check the integrity of backup power generators. I did not look like the director of integration assurance. I certainly did not look like the sole person in this city holding the final digital authorization key required to release the $80 million transfer. The room was already buzzing with executives and legal aides. No one paid me any mind as I stepped further into the space. To them, I was invisible. I was part of the background machinery that kept the lights on and the elevators running. Near the massive mahogany conference table, a young catering assistant in a crisp white shirt was nervously arranging a silver coffee service. His hands were shaking slightly under the weight of the enormous thermal carafe. As he tried to adjust a tray of porcelain cups, his elbow caught the handle of the carafe. It tipped, fell, and hit the marble floor with a sharp, echoing crack. A dark, steaming puddle of French roast coffee rapidly spread across the pristine white stone, creeping dangerously close to the leather briefcases resting near the chairs. The low hum of corporate chatter snapped into a heavy, irritated silence. The young man dropped to his knees, frantically trying to dab at the expanding puddle with a meager stack of cocktail napkins. From the far side of the room, a woman stepped forward. She was immaculate. Her tailored ivory dress was sharply cut, her blonde hair flawlessly blown out, and the diamonds on her wrists caught the overhead lights with aggressive brilliance. This was Sloane Holloway. She was not an executive. She was not on the board. She was the wife of Reed Holloway, the chief executive officer of North Briar. Yet, she moved through the room with the practiced authority of a queen surveying her fractured court. Sloane sighed loudly, a sound designed to draw every eye in the room to her irritation. She looked down at the catering assistant with absolute disdain, then lifted her gaze. Her eyes swept across the room and landed directly on me. She took in my damp utility jacket. She catalogued the scuff marks on my heavy boots. She stared at the thick, unbranded binder clamped under my arm. Her perfectly sculpted eyebrows drew together in a tight V of aristocratic annoyance. "You?" Sloane said, her voice cutting through the silent room like a serrated blade. "The janitor." She did not ask. She stated it as an undeniable fact of the universe. A few heads turned in my direction. I felt the collective weight of a dozen pairs of eyes, all belonging to highly paid vice presidents and senior legal counsel, pinning me to the doorway. Sloane raised a manicured hand and pointed sharply toward an alcove near the secondary entrance, where the building's actual maintenance staff had temporarily abandoned a yellow utility bucket and a damp string mop. "Clean it up before someone slips," Sloane commanded. Her tone was devoid of any human warmth. It was the voice of a woman who was entirely accustomed to moving people around like inanimate pieces of furniture. A ripple of low, sycophantic laughter washed through the room. It was that cruel, polite corporate chuckle, the kind meant to validate the power of the person making the joke while simultaneously degrading the target. They were laughing at the hired help. They were laughing at me. I shifted my gaze toward the center of the table. Reed Holloway sat in the oversized leather chair reserved for the chief executive. His silver hair caught the light. He wore a suit that likely cost more than the catering assistant made in 6 months. Reed had seen the entire exchange. He had heard his wife publicly humiliate a stranger in a room full of crucial stakeholders. Reed did not flinch. He did not gently correct his wife or suggest she lower her voice. He did not offer a word of professional courtesy. Instead, he simply licked his thumb, turned the page of the legal prospectus in front of him, and adjusted his reading glasses. He completely dismissed my humanity, treating the incident as a trivial disruption not worth his valuable time. My pulse beat a steady, rhythmic drum against my throat. I felt a hot, bright spike of anger ignite behind my ribs, but I forced my jaw to remain completely relaxed. Decades of working in male-dominated engineering sectors had taught me how to compress my rage into a tight, cold, and highly weaponized core. I took a slow step forward, my eyes scanning the massive mahogany table. There were silver nameplates positioned perfectly in front of each leather chair. I read the names engraved in black script: Mercer Dane, Chief Operating Officer, Ivy Redden, Crownbridge Legal Counsel, Nolan Price, Independent Risk Assessor. I looked at the empty space at the very end of the table. It was the seat positioned directly across from the presentation screen. The seat designated for the ultimate buyer's representative. The surface of the wood was bare. My nameplate was missing. That was the exact moment the air in the room seemed to change texture. This was no longer just a story about an arrogant, wealthy wife making a superficial error based on my clothing. This was an active erasure. Someone in this company had deliberately removed my name from this table. They had set up this closing ceremony with the assumption that I would not be present, or worse, that my presence was merely a rubber stamp to be acquired after the champagne was popped. I could have spoken up right then. I could have walked over to the table, dropped my heavy, water-damaged binder onto the polished mahogany, and introduced myself. I could have watched the smug satisfaction drain from Sloane Holloway's face. I could have watched Reed Holloway choke on his expensive silence. It would have been a fast, loud, and incredibly satisfying explosion. But a fast explosion only burns the surface. I needed to see the foundation. I needed to know exactly how deep the rot went at Northbriar Signal Systems. If they were willing to treat a perceived nobody with this level of casual cruelty, and if they were actively trying to bypass the Director of Integration Assurance on the day of an $80 million signing, there was something fundamentally broken in their architecture. I looked at the spilled coffee. I looked at the terrified catering assistant still clutching his wet napkins. Then, I looked at Sloane Holloway, who was already turning her back on me, her attention returning to the important men in the room. I did not say a word. I walked slowly across the room, the heavy tread of my boots sounding like a steady countdown. I went to the alcove. I reached out and wrapped my fingers around the rough wooden handle of the mop. It felt solid, grounding. I carried the mop over to the spill. I kept my head bowed, letting my dark hair fall forward to obscure my face. I pressed the wet strings of the mop against the marble floor, dragging the dark liquid into the fibers. I decided in that moment to remain the janitor. I would stay completely silent for the next few minutes. I would push this mop. I would wipe their floor, and I would listen. I wanted to see exactly how far these people would expose their true nature, their lies, and their broken systems, all while believing that the woman standing right next to them was absolutely nobody at all. I kept the mop moving and my head down, letting them believe I belonged to the background, but my attention was on the presentation screen and every word spoken around that table. Mercer Dane, the Chief Operating Officer of Northbriar, stood at the head of the room, holding a laser pointer like a conductor's baton. He was a man who wore his ambition like a heavy cologne, and right now, He was suffocating the room with it. "We are guaranteeing a perfectly seamless integration protocol," Mercer announced, his voice smooth, confident, and utterly devoid of hesitation. "Our network stability metrics, as you can see mapped out on the central dashboard, demonstrate a fault tolerance of 99.9% across all primary and secondary sector hubs. We are fully prepared to initiate the deployment phase." I stared at the bar graphs and heat maps glowing brightly on the screen. The visuals were sleek, ascending steadily in reassuring, authoritative shades of corporate blue. They depicted a flawless technological ecosystem, a network robust enough to handle any municipal emergency the city could throw at it. There was only one problem. The data was a complete fabrication. I did not need to reference the thick, water-damaged binder I had left resting on a side console to know this. I had audited those exact figures myself over 90 days ago. The presentation Mercer was so proudly displaying was pulling archived data from the third quarter of the previous fiscal year. It completely omitted the catastrophic load-balancing failure I had witnessed with my own eyes just 7 hours prior. At 6 o'clock this very morning, I had been standing in ankle-deep sludge at the Northern Relay Station, watching their primary cooling units fail under a basic stress test. If this system went live today, a minor power surge would blind the city's emergency response grid within 20 minutes. Yet, here in this climate-controlled sanctuary, Mercer was selling a ghost system, confidently lying to the Crown Bridge representatives. "What about the warranty commitments for the secondary power arrays?" asked one of the Crown Bridge legal aides, a sharp-looking woman sitting near the middle of the table. "Our risk department flagged a potential delay in hardware replacement during severe weather events," before Mercer could open his mouth to deploy another carefully crafted piece of fiction. A new voice cut effortlessly through the heavy air of the boardroom. "We have secured a full, unconditional replacement guarantee within 24 hours for any hardware malfunction, regardless of weather conditions," Sloan Holloway announced. I paused my mop mid-swing. My hands tightened around the rough wood of the handle. I slowly shifted my weight, turning my body just enough to see her clearly. Sloan was leaning comfortably back in her plush leather chair, swirling a glass of sparkling water. She spoke with the absolute certainty of a chief executive. She had absolutely no legal standing in this room. She was the CEO's wife. She was not a vendor. She was not an underwriter. She held no equity in the infrastructure division, and she was certainly not a certified systems engineer. Legally speaking, she was a civilian. Yet, here she was, casually committing Northbriar to legally binding warranty liabilities in the final hour of an $80 million government procurement negotiation. I waited for the inevitable correction. I waited for Reed Holloway to hold up a hand, to politely laugh off his wife's enthusiasm, and to remind the room that official terms would be addressed by the legal counsel. I waited for Mercer to subtly steer the conversation back to the authorized representatives. Reed did nothing of the sort. He simply offered a thin, approving smile, looking at his wife as if she had just selected the perfect wine for dinner. Mercer Dane actually nodded in vigorous agreement with her fabricated timeline, seamlessly incorporating her lie into his presentation. The silence from the rest of the Northbriar legal team was deafening. No one objected. No one even blinked. That collective, cowardly silence was infinitely more damning than any flooded server room. It revealed a corporate culture where the fundamental boundaries of authority had completely rotted away. If a woman with zero operational function could dictate critical warranty terms in a high-stakes government negotiation without a single senior executive daring to correct her, then Northbriar Signal Systems was not a functional, compliant tech infrastructure company. It was a private monarchy masquerading as a publicly accountable corporation. I pushed the mop closer to the edge of the table, maneuvering carefully around the discarded cocktail napkins. As I neared Sloane's chair, my eyes locked onto the lanyard hanging casually from the strap of her designer handbag resting on the floor. Attached to the clip was a temporary silver visitor pass. In the strict security protocols of this building, a silver badge meant lobby access, cafeteria privileges, and supervised escort to general meeting rooms. It explicitly prohibited entry into any secured floor conducting closed-door government bidding operations. She was physically sitting in a legally restricted zone, actively manipulating a public infrastructure deal, wearing a piece of plastic meant for someone delivering lunch. As I absorbed the sheer audacity of this compliance violation, I felt a heavy, piercing gaze land squarely on me. The sensation was physical, like a sudden drop in air pressure. I shifted my peripheral vision past Sloane's chair. Looking down the long expanse of polished mahogany, Nolan Price, the independent risk assessor hired by the Crown Bridge Board, was staring directly at me. Nolan was a man paid handsomely to find anomalies, to locate the single loose thread that could unravel a multi-million-dollar tapestry. Right now, he was not looking at me with the aristocratic disgust that Sloane had shown. His eyes were narrowed, analytical, and sharp. He looked at my heavy, mud-scuffed boots, which were completely out of place on the imported stone floor. He looked at the thick, unbranded technical binder resting on the console behind me. He watched the way I was no longer actually scrubbing the floor, but simply shifting the mop head in a slow, calculated rhythm while tracking every single word spoken in the room. A faint, troubled crease appeared between his eyebrows. He knew. He did not know my name, and he did not know my title, but his instincts were screaming at him. He recognized the cold, predatory focus of a predator in a room full of oblivious prey. He knew I was not a janitor, yet he remained silent, his hands folded tightly on the table. Perhaps he was waiting to see how the disaster would unfold. Or perhaps he was simply too afraid to disrupt the unstoppable momentum of the executives surrounding him. "Let us keep our eyes on the finish line, ladies and gentlemen," Mercer Danes suddenly announced, clapping his hands together once to draw the room's attention back to the digital display. He was sweating slightly above his collar now. He began checking his heavy gold wristwatch with increasing, nervous frequency. All internal compliance audits are complete. Every operational metric has been reviewed, cross-referenced, and strictly verified by our engineering heads. The physical infrastructure is ready. We are simply waiting on the final project launch authorization to begin the 90-day deployment phase. He was pushing the pace relentlessly. The artificial urgency in his voice was palpable. He was trying to suffocate any further inquiries with the heavy blanket of impending victory. Standing there, entirely invisible in my dark jacket, holding a damp string mop, the entire architecture of their trap suddenly illuminated in my mind like a brilliant, terrifying schematic diagram. They knew the Northern Relay Station was a disaster. They knew I was scheduled to inspect that exact site this morning. They had intentionally arranged this massive, theatrical signing ceremony at the exact same time, banking on the certainty that I would be delayed in the field. They had removed my nameplate from the table because they never intended for me to take my seat. They were relying on the sheer, overwhelming gravitational pull of an $80 million closing to force the deal through. They assumed that by the time I dried off, drove back into the city, and filed my official discrepancy report, the contracts would already be signed. The celebratory champagne would be drunk, and the press releases would be sent. They planned to bury my catastrophic failure data as a minor post-launch integration issue, rather than the fatal pre-launch violation it truly was. They were trying to outrun the truth. They were trying to steal authorization before the reality of their broken system could catch up to them. I looked down at the mop in my hands, then up at Mercer Danes' desperate, smiling face. They thought they had perfectly orchestrated a bloodless coup. They had no idea they had just handed the executioner a front-row ticket, complete with a mop to clean up the mess I was about to make. The smell of burnt copper and ozone was still fresh in my memory, a sharp contrast to the filtered, lavender-scented air of the boardroom. Just 7 hours ago, the reality of Northbrier's signal systems had not been a neat, glowing graph on a high-definition screen. It had been a chaotic, deafening subterranean concrete bunker at the Northern Relay Station. I stood in the back of that command center at dawn, watching their primary cooling unit scream under a basic stress test. The massive industrial fans had choked, sputtered, and died. Then, the backup power sequence initiated. I had timed it on my own chronometer. 17 minutes. That was exactly how long their multi-million-dollar secondary power array survived under a 70% municipal load before entirely collapsing. 17 minutes before the main terminal flashed a blinding, critical red warning, signaling a total network blackout. According to the very contracts resting on the mahogany table right in front of me, that array was legally mandated to withstand a 72-hour continuous outage without a single dropped packet. Amidst the blaring sirens of the failing station, a regional site manager had shoved his way into the control booth. His hard hat was perfectly clean, a sure sign he rarely stepped off the executive elevator. He did not ask what went wrong. He did not ask how to fix the cooling units. He simply looked at the panicked console operators and pointed a trembling finger at the main diagnostic monitor. "Put the old dashboard up for now," the manager had barked, his voice cracking with panic. "Wipe the active logs and revert the visual display to yesterday's baseline." 10 minutes later, I had cornered a junior night shift technician near the emergency stairwell. The kid looked physically ill, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold his thermostatic scanner. When I asked him to verify the manual override, he broke. "They do not want the fault logged," he had whispered to me, his eyes darting toward the security cameras. "Management sent an encrypted directive at 3 in the morning. They said we just need to get through today. They said whatever is broken, we will fix it under the guise of routine maintenance next week. Tomorrow, it becomes a post-launch patch. If we log a critical failure today, the Crown Bridge deal dies." Now, standing in the opulent uptown Charlotte boardroom, my hands wrapped around a damp wooden mop handle, I stared at the massive projection screen behind the chief operating officer. Mercer Dane was beaming, gesturing expansively at the data. I instantly recognized the user interface glowing on the screen. The specific font weight of the status indicators, the perfectly symmetrical green circles representing the relay nodes, the complete absence of the thermal variance tracker. It was the exact fabricated display the site manager had ordered. Mercer was actively projecting the old dashboard. Northbriar was presenting a deliberately engineered cover-up of a catastrophic infrastructure failure as absolute proof of their core competency. My gaze shifted down from the screen to the digital prospectus mirrored on the embedded monitors lining the center of the conference table. The document was open to the personnel and maintenance appendix. There, highlighted in a reassuring shade of blue, was a legally binding clause guaranteeing a 24/7 rotating roster of Tier 3 certified engineers dedicated exclusively to the Crown Bridge emergency grid. It was mathematically and legally impossible. As part of my preliminary vendor audit last month, I had secretly cross-referenced Northbriar's state labor filings, their active payroll tax records, and their certified employee rosters. This company barely retained enough Tier 3 engineers to cover an 8-hour daytime shift across their existing client base, let alone a continuous, round-the-clock emergency deployment team exclusively for us. They did not have the headcount. They were selling phantom engineers to guard the lives of real citizens. This entire signing ceremony was not a celebration. It was a brilliantly constructed, highly synchronized trap. And it was built entirely on the assumption of my geographic absence. As the Director of Integration Assurance for the Crown Bridge Civic Response Authority, I held the only digital authorization key capable of releasing the $80 million escrow fund. My digital signature was not a mere administrative formality. It was the absolute, final, unbypassable lock on the entire agreement. If I did not input my sequence, the contract remained a worthless stack of paper. Northbriar knew this. They also knew I was supposed to be off-site at the Northern Relay Station all morning. They had deliberately engineered this high-profile closing event at the exact time they assumed I would be trapped miles away, knee-deep in flooded conduit trenches. The corporate strategy was terrifyingly clear: gather the board, corral our legal team, sign the ceremonial documents, take the press photographs, and establish an overwhelming momentum of victory. They wanted to execute a close first, update later maneuver. By the time I supposedly returned from the field, exhausted and bearing a negative report, the champagne would already be empty. The money would technically be committed. they banked on the psychological pressure of a done deal. They believed that no single mid-level director would dare to withhold an authentication key and blow up an $80 million public-private partnership just because of a few minor technical discrepancies. They intended to turn my ultimate veto power into a passive, forced surrender. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the fraud made a sharp question rise in my throat. I shifted my weight, letting the head of the mop rest heavily against the marble. I opened my mouth, intending to break my silence. I wanted to ask Mercer Dane a highly specific, painstakingly technical question about the thermal load balancing threshold of the Northern Relay. I wanted to watch the blood drain from his face as he realized the janitor possessed the specific forensic knowledge to dismantle his entire presentation. Before a single syllable could vibrate through my vocal cords, a heavy square object flew through the air and slammed into the floor right next to the toe of my work boot. It was a heavy leather tissue box. It bounced once, scattering thick white paper across the coffee-stained marble. I looked up. Sloane Holloway was glaring at me. Her arm was still slightly suspended in the follow-through of the throw. The performative, aristocratic sweetness she had displayed moments ago was completely gone, replaced by a vicious, undisguised venom. She had seen my slight forward movement, noticed my parted lips, and interpreted it as an unforgivable breach of the social hierarchy. A member of the invisible class was about to speak, and she refused to tolerate it. "Pick that up," Sloane snapped. Her voice was no longer a polite command. It was a cold, acoustic whip that sliced through the quiet hum of the boardroom. The executives froze. The legal aides stopped typing. Sloane leaned forward in her leather chair, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at my face. "And keep your mouth shut. Do not interrupt grown-up work." In her mind, she was simply putting an insolent cleaner in her place. She thought she was defending her husband's stage. She had absolutely no idea what she had just done. By aggressively ordering me to remain silent, and by physically throwing an object to stop me from speaking during a formal government vendor review, Sloane Holloway had just crossed a massive, irrecoverable legal boundary. She had actively and visibly suppressed an inquiry during a highly regulated, closed-door procurement negotiation. She had just handed me the final, undeniable piece of forensic evidence I needed to destroy them. She had weaponized her own blinding arrogance, transforming a petty, classist insult into a fully documented, legally actionable instance of unauthorized contractual interference. I looked at the tissue box at my feet, then back up at the CEO's wife, and I closed my mouth. I did not need to ask my question anymore. The trap had finally snapped shut, but they were the ones bleeding inside it. Reed Holloway raised his right hand, two fingers extended in a subtle, practiced flick that carried the absolute authority of an emperor directing his court. It was the universal executive signal for the legal team to bring the theater to its climax. Immediately, the lead counsel for Northbriar stepped forward from the shadows of the periphery, carrying a stack of thick linen-pressed folios. These were the ceremonial documents, printed on heavyweight archival paper designed specifically to look historic in photographs. Through the frosted glass of the heavy boardroom doors, I could see the shifting silhouettes of the in-house public relations team pacing in the corridor. They had photographers stationed out there, camera lenses primed to capture the exact handshake, the precise forced smile that would publicly seal the $80 million transaction. The air inside the room grew incredibly thick, saturated with the intoxicating, dangerous perfume of premature victory. It was a suffocating atmosphere, heavy with the weight of a triumph built entirely on a hollow, rotting foundation. Mercer Dane capitalized on the quiet reverence settling over the room, his voice dropping into a smooth, reassuring baritone meticulously engineered for press releases and investor calls. "We are looking at a comprehensive, system-wide rollout in exactly 90 days, Mercer promised, leaning his palms flat against the polished mahogany table to emphasize his absolute certainty. 90 days. It was a beautiful, digestible soundbite for the municipal stakeholders, a number that would look fantastic on the front page of the financial gazettes. It was also a physical, technical, and temporal impossibility. You cannot deploy a massive, interconnected civic response grid in 3 months when the foundational architecture is bleeding out under basic stress loads. A 90-day timeline required a flawless baseline, and their baseline had literally melted down in front of me just a few hours prior. Mercer was not just lying, he was constructing a massive financial liability out of thin air, banking entirely on the hope that the truth would remain buried under layers of bureaucratic red tape. From the center of the table, Ivy Redden shifted in her leather chair. As the lead legal counsel for Crownbridge, her entire professional existence was predicated on finding the hidden traps in rooms exactly like this one. Her job was to be the designated skeptic, the one who refused to drink the celebratory champagne until the glass had been independently inspected for cracks. Before we finalize the timeline, Mercer, I need clarity on the operational confirmation chain, Ivy said, her tone meticulously professional but laced with a distinctly sharp edge. Our board requires explicit verified sign-offs from the integration teams on both sides prior to the public announcement. Where are those specific confirmations housed in the current document stack? Mercer did not miss a single beat. He unleashed a torrent of corporate jargon, weaving a dense, impenetrable web of half-technical deflection and aggressive public relations spin. He talked extensively about synergistic alignment, parallel validation tracks, and holistic system readiness, never once providing a direct factual answer to Ivy's highly specific question. He was tap dancing over a minefield, using buzzwords as a smokescreen to hide the massive, gaping hole where my authorization signature was supposed to be. He was trying to push the Crownbridge delegation past the point of no return, using the sheer momentum of the ceremonial signing to crush any lingering legal hesitations. Deep inside the right pocket of my damp, dark utility jacket, my encrypted company smartphone began to vibrate. It was a specific, rhythmic pulse against my hip. 2 short bursts, 1 long. I knew exactly what that pattern meant. It was the automated internal system notification from Crownbridge headquarters. The digital launch authorization package had just been formally generated by the procurement software and was now suspended in the secure cloud, actively waiting for my authorization code. It was the digital trigger. The final barrier, without my specific string of code, the $80 million remained securely locked behind an impenetrable financial firewall. The physical papers they were passing around the table were completely meaningless until that digital lock was opened. Northbriar was desperately trying to build the roof before the foundation was poured, hoping no one would notice the building was floating in midair. I slowly shifted my gaze back to the mirrored digital prospectus glowing on the individual monitors embedded in the table. My eyes locked onto the final page of the digital terms and conditions. The text was small, dense, and written in the sterile, airtight language of corporate contract law, but to me, the words seemed to burn with a harsh, glaring light. 2 specific phrases stood out, demanding my absolute attention: vendor integrity, authority segregation. In the high-stakes world of municipal infrastructure contracts, those 2 phrases represented the absolute boundary lines of acceptable corporate conduct. Vendor integrity required complete, unvarnished transparency regarding technical capabilities and operational failures. Authority segregation mandated that only legally designated personnel could influence, alter, or approve the terms of the agreement. They were the very concepts Northbriar was actively butchering right in front of my eyes. In their arrogance, they had documented the exact rules they were currently breaking. Later, those precise words would become the sharpened blades I would use to sever this entire fraudulent enterprise at the neck. The ceremonial folios were now distributed around the table, crisp white pages resting expectantly on the dark wood. Sloane Holloway, seemingly emboldened by her previous display of absolute dominance over me, leaned aggressively forward. She casually reached out and flipped open the primary signature page of the master contract resting in front of the lead Crownbridge delegate. Her heavy diamond rings clicked softly against the table as she dragged her manicured index finger down the list of signatory lines, scanning the names with proprietary interest. She had absolutely no legal clearance to view those specific documents, let alone physically handle them during a closed, highly classified procurement session. By actively touching that paper, by imposing her physical presence over the final agreement, she was actively tainting the legal chain of custody. She was grinding another layer of contamination into an already filthy process, proving beyond any reasonable doubt that the segregation of authority at Northbriar was a complete illusion. Reed Holloway watched his wife handle the restricted state documents and simply smiled at the Crown Bridge representatives. It was a smile of absolute, unconquerable arrogance. He believed the war was over. He believed his power was absolute, that his company was untouchable, and that the rules of compliance simply did not apply to a man of his stature. The illusion of inevitable success he projected was so powerful, so utterly convincing, that the atmosphere in the room fundamentally shifted. The tension dissolved into a relaxed, jovial anticipation. I watched two of the junior Crown Bridge delegates discreetly pull out their smartphones and begin quietly rebooking their return flights to an earlier departure time. They had completely bought into the performance. They thought the heavy lifting was done, the due diligence completed. They genuinely believed the signing in front of them was merely a required piece of administrative theater before the real celebration could begin. They were ready to go home, completely unaware that they were about to sign away $80 million to a system that would fail the city on its very first day. They were all completely intoxicated by their own fabricated reality. Drunk on the illusion of a closed deal, it was time to leave them to it. I took a slow, deliberate step backward, moving out of the harsh, illuminating glare of the overhead pendant lights and into the muted, forgiving shadows near the secondary entrance. I lifted the wooden mop, feeling the rough grain of the handle one last time, and carefully propped it against the corner of the wall. I ensured the damp cotton strings rested squarely on the tile baseboard, a quiet monument to their collective arrogance. I reached down to the low console table and picked up my water-damaged technical binder, clutching the heavy stack of catastrophic failure diagnostics tightly against my chest. I turned toward the heavy glass door leading out to the reception area. I did not run. I did not increase my pace. I did not make a single unnecessary sound. I simply walked out of the 52nd floor boardroom, my steel-toed boots stepping softly across the imported marble. The room was so entirely consumed by its own hubris, so deeply entrenched in the orchestrated theater of the deal, that not a single person turned their head. Not one highly paid executive, not one sharp legal counsel, not one vigilant assistant bothered to look up and ask the departing janitor who she actually was, or why she was carrying a secure data file. They let me walk right out the door with the absolute power to destroy them tucked safely under my arm. It was, without a single doubt, the most astronomically expensive mistake they would ever make in their entire lives. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung shut behind me, instantly silencing the suffocating hum of corporate victory. The corridor of the 52nd floor was entirely empty, a long stretch of plush, sound-absorbing carpet and muted architectural lighting. I did not turn back. I did not call after them. I did not storm back into that room to demand an apology or throw my weight around. Anger is a volatile, messy fuel. I preferred the cold, absolute precision of a well-executed protocol. I leaned my shoulder against the cool pane of a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city, set my water-damaged binder on a narrow ledge, and pulled my encrypted smartphone from my jacket pocket. My first action was surgical. I bypassed the standard communication channels and dialed the direct emergency extension of my deputy director back at Crown Bridge headquarters. He answered on the first ring. "Initiate a hard freeze on the automated launch sequence for the Northbriar account," I instructed, keeping my voice completely flat and devoid of any adrenaline. "Lock it down at the root level. No authorization code is to be accepted under any circumstances." "Understood," he replied, his tone instantly shifting to high alert. He knew me well enough not to ask for an explanation over an unsecured voice line. "The mechanism is frozen. We are holding at 0% execution." I disconnected the call. The $80 million was now trapped safely on our side of the wall. The physical papers they were eagerly signing inside that boardroom were now legally equivalent to blank scratchpad paper. Next, I opened the secure, heavily encrypted portal linked directly to the Crownbridge internal audit servers. This was where the real counterattack began. I did not deal in bruised egos. I dealt in verifiable data. I systematically uploaded my arsenal. First went the high-resolution photographs I had taken at 6 o'clock this morning, showing the ankle-deep water flooding the subterranean power trenches of the northern relay station. Second, I uploaded the raw, unedited system diagnostic logs I had extracted directly from the failing terminal, undeniably documenting the catastrophic secondary array collapse after exactly 17 minutes of partial load. Third, I attached a cropped, digitally enhanced image I had discreetly snapped while leaning on the mop. It clearly showed the silver temporary visitor badge dangling from Sloan Holloway's designer handbag, firmly placing a civilian inside a restricted, classified government bidding room. Finally, I uploaded a detailed memorandum outlining the exact visual discrepancies between the active failure data and the fabricated third-quarter dashboard Mercer Dane was currently projecting on their screen. As the upload progress bar hit 100%, my phone vibrated in my palm, the screen illuminated with the name Reed Holloway. The chief executive officer was calling the director of integration assurance. He must have finally noticed the empty chair at the end of the table, or perhaps the digital escrow system had just bounced back an error message to his finance team indicating the funds were locked. I stared at the glowing screen. I let it vibrate against my hand until the call went to voicemail. 10 seconds later, the device buzzed again. This time, it was Mercer Dane. The chief operating officer was likely sweating through his expensive silk shirt, realizing his 90-day deployment lie was suddenly missing its foundational signature. I let his call ring out into the silent hallway. A minute passed. A new, unlisted premium number flashed on the display. It did not take a forensic analyst to guess that Sloan had somehow acquired my contact information and was attempting to deploy her aristocratic brand of damage control. I silenced the device entirely. Let them wait. Let them stand in that lavish room, holding their expensive pens, and slowly taste the cold, creeping panic of being firmly locked outside the door. They had spent the entire morning treating me like background noise. Now they were about to learn what happens when you ignore the one person who can stop the deal. Instead of wasting breath on a heated confrontation, I drafted a rapid, legally binding preservation order. I sent it simultaneously to the Northbriar Corporate Compliance Office, the building's chief security officer, and our own external legal counsel. The directive was unambiguous. I demanded the immediate preservation of all closed-circuit television footage from the 52nd floor lobby and hallways. I mandated the lockdown of all radio frequency identification badge swipe logs for the boardroom doors. Furthermore, I legally sequestered the electronic entry logs and security camera feeds from the northern relay stations spanning the last 24 hours. I was sealing the exits. I was ensuring that when they inevitably tried to scrub the servers and delete the evidence of their cover-up, they would be walking directly into a charge of destroying evidence during an active municipal audit. My phone vibrated with a single, highly prioritized text message. It was Ivy Redden. The lead Crownbridge legal counsel was not calling to issue a polite inquiry. She knew my reputation. If I had walked out of a closing ceremony and triggered a hard financial freeze, she knew the ground beneath us had just caved in. Her text simply read, "Call me on the secure line." Now, I dialed her encrypted number. She answered before the first ring finished. "Ella," Ivy said. Her voice was cautious, stripped of the performative corporate cheer she had used inside the boardroom. She was no longer speaking to a forgotten nameplate. She was speaking to the person holding the detonator. She asked the exact right question. The first intelligent and decent question anyone had asked all day. Where was the process contaminated? Across multiple critical vectors, I answered, my tone pure, clinical contract law. We have unauthorized, unvetted third-party interference physically present in a classified bidding environment. We have gross, documented misrepresentation of current operational readiness and fault tolerance capabilities. and we have overwhelming contextual evidence indicating an intentional, coordinated effort to bypass the authorized approval chain to force a premature signing. Ivy inhaled sharply through her teeth. Do you have the data to back that up? It is already sitting in the secure portal, I replied. Check your encrypted inbox. The presentation they are giving right now is built on archived data, meant to cover up a total system collapse that occurred at dawn. And the person currently dictating warranty terms to your junior delegates is a civilian wearing a lobby visitor pass. Good God, Ivy murmured, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. I will lock down our delegation immediately. We are pulling out. Do not alert them yet, I countered. Let them finish their ceremony. Let them put their signatures on those fabricated documents. The heavier the ink, the tighter the noose. While I stood in the hallway weaving the net, the data I had uploaded was automatically forwarded to the highest level of the Crown Bridge hierarchy. Celeste Rowan, the chairwoman of the board, was a woman who did not tolerate corporate games. Unlike other political appointees who might try to sweep a disaster under the rug to save face, Celeste operated with a ruthless, surgical integrity. Within 10 minutes of my upload, I received a notification that Celeste had personally bypassed the standard internal review committee. She had silently opened a top-tier emergency investigative protocol. There would be no quiet settlements. There would be no backdoor handshakes to smooth things over. The machine was now awake, and its gears were turning strictly toward a brutal, transparent reckoning. I finally pulled myself away from the window and began walking toward the private elevator banks reserved for executive exits. Through the thick walls, I could barely make out the muffled, rhythmic sound of applause erupting from the boardroom. They were clapping. Someone had popped a bottle of champagne. The Northbriar executives were raising their glasses, toasting to their brilliance, celebrating the fact that the deal was practically done. They were smiling for the internal photographers, entirely convinced that they had successfully outsmarted the system, bypassed the annoying technicalities, and secured their $80 million prize. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor. As the heavy steel doors slid shut, cutting off the faint sound of their premature celebration, I felt a profound, cold sense of satisfaction. They were currently standing at the absolute peak of their arrogance, oblivious to the fact that the floor beneath them had already been removed. And every single second they spent celebrating was only going to make the impending freefall that much more devastating. I sat in the driver's seat of my municipal utility vehicle, parked exactly 3 blocks away from the towering glass facade of the Northbriar headquarters. The engine was off. The cabin was completely silent, insulated from the afternoon city traffic. My encrypted smartphone rested on the passenger seat, vibrating with an aggressive, continuous rhythm. They had been trying to breach my silence for 45 minutes. I let them bleed out their panic. I let the champagne go warm in their glasses. When the screen illuminated with a secure multi-party conference line request originating from the executive communications desk, I finally reached over and accepted the connection. I did not say hello. I simply breathed into the receiver, letting the dead air establish the new hierarchy. "Ella," Reed Holloway said. His voice rushed through the speaker, entirely stripped of the booming imperial resonance it had possessed in the boardroom. It was tight, carefully modulated, and painfully desperate. "Thank God we finally reached you. We have been trying to get a hold of your office for nearly an hour." I remained silent. "Listen, we have a terrible misunderstanding on our hands," Reed continued, rushing to fill the void. "A catastrophic, regrettable misunderstanding. We were completely unaware that you had arrived directly from the field. Given the chaotic environment before the signing, and quite frankly, your highly unconventional attire for a closing ceremony, there was a profound failure in recognition. I want to personally apologize for the confusion. Confusion, misunderstanding, unconventional attire." He was actively trying to shrink the entire incident into a simple wardrobe malfunction, a minor social faux pas caused by poor lighting and bad timing. Before I could dissect his pathetic defense, a second voice chimed in. It was a fraction too high, laced with an artificial fragility that made my teeth ache. "Ella, "This is Sloan," the CEO's wife said. She sounded entirely different from the woman who had thrown a box of tissues at my boots. Now, she was playing the role of the overwhelmed, exhausted victim. "I am just absolutely mortified. You have to understand, it was such an incredibly stressful day for everyone. The pressure of these massive government deals is just so intense. I thought I was simply asking a member of the building staff for a small favor. I truly meant absolutely no disrespect by it. It was just a terribly tense morning." She had reduced a public humiliation steeped in class contempt into a small favor requested under pressure. She wanted me to comfort her. She wanted me to absolve her because she was stressed. "Let us cut right to the chase here," a third voice interrupted. Mercer Dane, the chief operating officer, could not stomach the emotional theater. He was a creature of momentum, and his $80 million deal was currently bleeding to death on the operating table. "Ella, apologies have been made. Mistakes happened. But we have a massive regional infrastructure initiative suspended in mid-air. We have press releases scheduled for 4 o'clock this afternoon. We need your authorization to release the escrow immediately. Just sign off on the launch protocol, authorize the funds, and we can clean up whatever hurt feelings or bureaucratic issues remain afterward. We can fix everything else later." There it was. The exact unvarnished corporate philosophy of Northbriar Signal Systems. Sign first, clean up later, hide the failure today, patch it tomorrow. It was the exact same corrupt methodology he had used to hide the catastrophic cooling failure at the Northern Relay Station at 6 o'clock this morning. Mercer was so deeply entrenched in his own fraudulent logic that he did not even realize he was confessing to his entire operational mindset on a recorded line. The air in my car felt absolutely freezing. I leaned my head back against the headrest and stared at the roof of the vehicle. I let their pathetic chorus of excuses, victimhood, and aggressive demands hang in the digital space between us. "I have 3 questions," I said. My voice was a flat, featureless plain of ice. "And you will answer them in order." The line went completely, breathlessly quiet. They were not accustomed to being commanded. "Question 1, I began, enunciating every single syllable with razor-sharp precision. "Who authorized a civilian with a silver lobby visitor badge to physically handle legally restricted government procurement documents inside a closed-door session?" I heard a sharp, sudden intake of breath. Someone on their end had just realized how much I had actually seen. "Question 2, I continued, striking the next blow before they could even attempt to recover. "Who authorized the field management team to manually bypass the critical failure logs at the Northern Relay Station and replace the live telemetry with an archived dashboard?" A muffled thud echoed through the speaker, sounding suspiciously like a heavy fist hitting a mahogany table. Mercer Dane was no longer talking about fixing things later. "Question 3, I finished, my tone dropping an octave lower, delivering the final, fatal strike. "Who physically removed my official nameplate from the boardroom table before the meeting began?" The silence that poured through the phone was not just quiet, it was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. It was the sound of 3 highly powerful people simultaneously realizing that they were completely trapped. They had spent the entire morning treating me like a bystander, never realizing I had been quietly gathering the evidence they kept handing me. 10 seconds passed, 20 seconds. The digital counter on my phone screen ticked upward, measuring the exact duration of their terror. That prolonged, agonizing silence spoke louder, clearer, and more honestly than any carefully drafted apology they could ever offer. It was an admission of complete systemic guilt. "Ella," Reed finally whispered. His voice was completely broken, stripped of all its executive armor. The arrogance was entirely gone, replaced by a raw, naked panic. "Please, I am begging you to look at the bigger picture here. I will arrange a private meeting. Just you and me, off the record. I will issue a formal, written apology. I will personally fire anyone in this entire organization who made you feel uncomfortable today. Just name them. I will handle it internally. We can make this right without destroying the partnership." He still did not understand. He genuinely believed this was about my bruised ego. He thought I was holding an $80 million public contract hostage because his wife had called me a janitor. He thought he could buy my silence with a private apology and a few sacrificial firings. He believed the system was fine, and only the people were flawed. I reached out and hovered my finger over the red disconnect icon on my screen. "You fundamentally misunderstand the nature of this conversation, Reed," I said, my words dropping like heavy stones into a deep, black well. "I am not interested in arguing about who was more rude to whom. I do not care about your wife's stress levels, and I do not want your private apologies. I am currently evaluating whether your entire corporate process is still clean enough to legally sign a government contract." I paused, letting the absolute severity of my statement settle over them like a shroud. "Based on the evidence I have already submitted to the Crown Bridge Audit Committee, the answer is no." I pressed the red button, instantly severing the connection. The cabin of my vehicle returned to perfect, undisturbed silence. I placed the phone back on the passenger seat, turned the key in the ignition, and pulled away from the curb. The trap was fully sprung, the locks were sealed, and there was absolutely nothing they could do but wait for the impact. The audit room at Crown Bridge headquarters felt less like an office and more like the inside of a high-security server tower. It was freezing, windowless, and humming with a sharp electrical tension. Over the next 48 hours, the preliminary data drop I had initiated detonated across the entire organizational structure. The emergency review team, composed of our most vicious forensic accountants, cybersecurity specialists, and compliance officers, tore into the digital architecture of Northbriar signal systems like a pack of starving wolves. When you pull a single loose thread in the fabric of corporate America, you rarely find just a simple knot. You almost always unravel an entire wardrobe of systemic rot. The first indisputable piece of empirical evidence materialized from the cross-referenced server logs. Our senior analyst laid the physical field diagnostics I had extracted from the northern relay stations side by side with the digital footprint of the presentation Mercer Dane had so confidently projected in the boardroom. The resulting delta between the two datasets was terrifying. The review team confirmed exactly what I already knew, but they translated it from an eyewitness account into mathematical fact. It was not a clerical error. It was not a delayed network synchronization. It was a manually inputted, hard-coded suppression of a critical operational failure. The truth was violently buried under lines of falsified code. Shortly after the data logs were verified, the building security footage arrived via an encrypted courier. The chief security officer handed me a heavy, rubberized tablet containing the high-definition closed-circuit feeds from the uptown Charlotte high-rise. I sat in a quiet corner of the audit room and watched the timestamp perfectly align with 7 o'clock in the morning. Sloan Holloway strolled into the 52nd floor boardroom long before any of the actual corporate executives or legal teams arrived. She was holding a steaming coffee cup, aggressively pointing a manicured finger at the terrified catering staff. Though the security footage completely lacked audio, her body language was an unmistakable broadcast of absolute entitlement. I watched her walk the entire length of the polished mahogany table. She paused specifically at the final chair, picked up a small silver object from the wood, and handed it directly to a busboy with a sharp, dismissive wave of her hand. It was my official nameplate. She had not simply forgotten I existed. She had actively, purposefully erased my physical presence to ensure the room belonged entirely to the illusion her husband was building. But Sloan was not merely a protective, arrogant spouse clearing the stage for a theatrical signing. The digital access logs painted a much darker, legally compromised picture of her daily involvement. By aggressively subpoenaing the radio frequency identification badge swipes for the executive elevator banks, our legal counsel discovered a glaring anomaly. Sloan had actively attended at least 3 other highly restricted vendor bidding sessions over the past 6 months. She held absolutely no legal function at Northbriar. She had signed no municipal non-disclosure agreements, and she possessed 0 security clearance. Yet she had been consistently embedded in their most sensitive financial negotiations. That specific anomaly prompted the forensic accounting team to dig directly into her personal financial disclosures. They followed the money, because in these circles, the money always tells the most honest story. They rapidly uncovered a boutique consulting firm quietly registered in the state of Delaware. The sole registered proprietor of this shadow entity was Sloan Holloway. Every single month, operating with the precision of a Swiss timepiece, that phantom consulting firm received a massive retainer fee from a Tier 2 hardware subcontractor deeply embedded in the North Briar supply chain. Suddenly, her aggressive, unprompted interjection about the unconditional hardware replacement warranty during the boardroom meeting made perfect, sickening sense. She was not passionately advocating for municipal network stability. She was actively securing a guaranteed revenue stream for a vendor that was directly kicking cash back into her own private bank accounts. It was a textbook case of illegal self-dealing, thinly disguised as enthusiastic corporate synergy. While Sloan's elaborate financial web was being meticulously mapped, Mercer Dane's operational cover-up was completely dismantled by a single, careless digital artifact. The Information Technology Forensics Unit recovered a recently deleted internal communication sent directly from Mercer's secure executive server to the lead night shift engineering manager. The text of the email was brutal and unambiguous. It explicitly directed the technical team to indefinitely delay uploading the official critical failure diagnostic until immediately after the 4 o'clock press release had gone live to the public. He had foolishly put his premeditated intent to defraud a municipal government in writing. Faced with a rapidly collapsing fortress, Reed Holloway desperately tried to build a legal firewall around himself. Communicating strictly through his aggressive defense counsel, the chief executive officer claimed he was entirely focused on the macro-level corporate strategy and had absolutely zero knowledge of his wife's specific illicit actions or his chief operating officer's blatant data manipulation. He attempted to paint himself as a brilliant but tragically betrayed visionary. However, his own corporate digital calendar completely destroyed that narrative. Internal event invitations and digital rehearsal schedules for the major pitch meetings clearly listed Sloan as a mandatory attendee for strategy alignment and narrative control. Reed had actively cultivated her role as a shadow executive. He allowed her to wield a dark, unchecked power that no one in the company was officially allowed to name, question, or challenge. He knew exactly what she was doing, and he actively endorsed the corruption because it served his bottom line. The most hollow, deeply unsettling revelation, however, did not emerge from a recovered server drive or a hidden bank record. It arrived via a secure digital delivery from Nolan Price. The highly paid independent risk assessor submitted a sworn, written affidavit directly to our board of directors. In 3 dense, heavily lawyered paragraphs, Nolan formally admitted that he had recognized my face from a previous infrastructure symposium the moment I walked into the boardroom. He explicitly confessed that when Sloan had publicly ordered me to mop the floor, he strongly suspected my true identity and the catastrophic implications of my presence. Yet, he chose to sit there, keeping his hands neatly folded on the mahogany table, and said absolutely nothing. He claimed in the document that he simply did not want to disrupt the delicate, high-stakes momentum of the negotiation over what might have been a potential case of mistaken identity. His sworn statement added a suffocating, depressing layer of moral cowardice to the entire scandal. Nolan represented the exact kind of quiet, complicit silence that allows completely corrupt systems to thrive and survive in plain sight. Armed with a thick, heavy file containing a mountain of irrefutable, deeply verified forensic evidence, I walked out of the audit room and took the elevator up to the top-floor office of Celeste Rowan. The chairwoman of the Crown Bridge board sat rigidly behind a massive, clear glass desk, meticulously reviewing the executive summary I had prepared for her. In the sterile, highly political world of massive municipal infrastructure contracts, the standard protocol for a mess this remarkably large was a quiet, heavily sanitized legal settlement. Typically, the offending vendor would pay a massive financial penalty. A few key executives would quietly resign to spend more time with their families, and the tax-paying public would never know how incredibly close the city came to a total emergency blackout. Northbrier's legal team had already sent frantic back-channel messages, practically begging for a closed-door arbitration process. They were offering massive pricing concessions, desperately trying to buy their way out of the blinding public spotlight. Celeste closed the heavy file folder, the sound echoing sharply in the quiet office. She looked up at me. Her dark eyes were completely hard, entirely devoid of any appetite for political compromise. "They want to settle this quietly," Celeste stated, her voice a flat, uncompromising baritone. "Their legal counsel just offered to slash the contract price by 20%. They want us to close the internal investigative file, sign a non-disclosure agreement, and let them bleed out in private. They built an entire highly successful corporate culture around hiding catastrophic failures in private," I replied, standing firm in front of her desk, refusing to blink. "If we agree to settle this behind closed doors, we actively validate their fraudulent methodology. We teach them that the absolute worst consequence for defrauding the public trust is a temporary dip in their quarterly profit margin." Celeste nodded slowly, her expression tightening into a mask of pure, executive resolve. She was entirely aligned with my assessment. She did not tolerate parasites nesting in her supply chain. "There will be no quiet settlements," Celeste declared, reaching out and pressing a silver button on her desktop intercom to summon her executive assistant. "Draft a formal, legally binding summons immediately. We are holding a final, mandatory public hearing. Instruct the Northbriar executive team, their lead legal counsel, and their independent financial underwriters to present themselves in the main auditorium tomorrow morning. We are going not just to open this corpse up, but we are going to dissect it under the brightest lights we possess." The morning after the audit commenced, my office began to smell overwhelmingly like a high-end funeral parlor. Northbriar Signal Systems had officially launched their aggressive, highly sanitized image rehabilitation campaign. It started with the floral arrangements. Massive, obnoxious displays of white orchids and imported lilies were delivered to the Crownbridge Administrative Reception Desk every 2 hours, all bearing my name. Following the flowers came the courier-delivered envelopes made of thick, cream-colored cardstock. These contained heavily drafted, legally vetted letters of apology signed by Reed Holloway. The letters were masterpieces of corporate deflection, expressing deep, profound regret for the unfortunate social friction and the regrettable lapse in executive hospitality. They were apologizing to the janitor they had insulted. They still completely failed to realize they needed to be apologizing to the city for the emergency network they had falsified. Then came the subtle, insidious political pressure. By the end of the second day, my secure desk line began ringing with calls from people who had absolutely no official jurisdiction over procurement, but held massive influence over municipal optics. I received calls from 2 city council members and a deputy mayor, all operating under the guise of being mutual friends of the project. Their scripts were identical. They would casually ask about my week, gently transition into discussing the tension with Northbriar, and then strategically drop the heavy weight of public expectation. "We really cannot afford to let a personal misunderstanding derail the entire regional timeline," one councilman told me, his voice dripping with paternalistic concern. "If we tear up this agreement now, the citizens will be left without an upgraded emergency response grid for at least another 6 to 8 months. We have to think about the greater good. Ella, sometimes you just have to hold your nose and sign the paper." It was a brilliantly terrifying tactic. They were trying to weaponize my own sense of public duty against me. They wanted to make me feel that by holding Northbriar accountable for their fraud, I was personally endangering the lives of the citizens who relied on the emergency grid. The suffocating atmosphere of the executive floor became too much to bear. I needed to breathe actual, unfiltered air. At 2 o'clock in the morning, I drove my municipal vehicle away from the gleaming downtown high-rises and headed back to the exact place where the lies had started. The Northern Relay Station was a brutalist concrete bunker sitting under the pale glow of sodium streetlights. During the day shift, the facility was crawling with Northbriar site managers and highly paid consultants making sure the right narratives were pushed. But at 2 o'clock in the morning, the suits were fast asleep in their expensive suburban homes. Only the ghosts and the night shift technicians remained. I walked into the break room carrying 2 large cardboard carriers of strong black coffee. The young technician I had spoken to during the catastrophic failure was sitting at a scratched laminate table, staring blankly at a cold vending machine sandwich. Across from him sat the veteran night shift supervisor, a woman whose face was lined with the exhaustion of 1,000 consecutive midnight rotations. They looked up, tense and defensive, until I set the coffee down and took off my jacket. I did not ask them for official statements or sworn affidavits. I just sat with them in the hum of the server racks and asked them how bad it really was. Without the regional managers breathing down their necks, the truth poured out like water from a ruptured main. The supervisor wrapped her hands around the hot paper cup and looked me dead in the eye. "They told us to put a cheap bandage on a massive arterial bleed," she said, her voice rough with suppressed anger. "The primary cooling loops are fundamentally incompatible with the secondary power arrays. We have been sending up red flag reports for 3 months. Every single time. Mercer Dane's office kicked the reports back down, telling us we were misinterpreting the data. When the system collapsed during your inspection, they panicked. They sent a direct override command from the executive terminal. They forced us to manually disable the thermal variance alarms and load a static, clean interface loop to the monitors. We were explicitly threatened with termination if we did not comply." Hearing the exact mechanics of their corruption spoken aloud in that dreary, fluorescent-lit break room solidified everything. This was not a company that made a mistake. This was a company that operated as a criminal enterprise. I returned to Crown Bridge headquarters just as the sun was coming up. Ivy Redden was already in her office, her desk buried under a chaotic mountain of printed contract addendums and legal precedents. When I walked in, she dropped her highlighter and leaned back in her chair. She looked exhausted, but her eyes were entirely feral. "I found the kill switch," Ivy said, tapping a perfectly manicured fingernail against a thick, highlighted paragraph. She turned the document around so I could read it. It was a deeply buried boilerplate compliance clause that Northbrier's legal team had likely skimmed over, assuming they possessed the political leverage to ignore it. "Before the final launch authorization sequence is verified," Ivy explained, her voice gaining momentum, "the purchasing authority retains the unilateral right to terminate the agreement. Without financial penalty, upon the discovery of any undeclared external influence over the bidding process, or any material misrepresentation of operational readiness, because you never typed in your cryptographic key. We are technically still in the pre-launch window. They handed us the absolute right to execute them." The walls were closing in on Northbriar from the outside as well. By noon, the massive insurance conglomerate that provided the $80 million surety bond for the project sent a devastatingly cold communication to our finance department. The underwriters had caught wind of our internal audit and the locked escrow account. They stated in uncompromising terms that if Crown Bridge decided to waive the discovered integrity violations and proceed with the compromised vendor, the underwriter would immediately revoke the completion bond. The financial safety net was completely gone. I was summoned to the top floor precisely at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Celeste Rowan was standing by the massive windows overlooking the city, her arms crossed over her chest. She did not bother offering me a seat. "Northbrier's legal defense team just filed a massive preemptive notice," Celeste said, turning to face me. "If we terminate this agreement based on your audit, they are going to unleash a scorched earth commercial lawsuit against us. They will sue for breach of contract. They will sue for bad faith negotiation, and they will likely name you personally in a defamation suit. They are going to drag this city through years of brutal, expensive litigation just to save their own skin." Celeste walked slowly over to her desk and placed both hands flat on the glass surface. Her gaze was incredibly heavy, demanding absolute honesty. "I have the authority to pull the plug," Celeste told me, "but I need to know if the person who caught them is willing to stand in the fire. Are you prepared to put your professional reputation on the line? Sit in a witness box and defend this cancellation against the most aggressive corporate lawyers in this state. I am, I answered without a single fraction of hesitation. But I have one non-negotiable condition. Celeste raised an eyebrow, waiting. If we do this, we do not do it quietly, I stated. There will be no sealed arbitration files. There will be no backroom political deals to soften the blow and save their public stock price. When I pull the trigger, every single piece of evidence goes on the main projector in front of the full board. Total exposure. A slow, grim smile touched the corners of Celeste's mouth. Agreed. Just before the close of business, the final chess piece moved. Desperate to stop the impending cancellation, Reed Holloway formally petitioned the Crown Bridge Board for one last chance to defend his company. He requested a full, mandatory hearing, bringing his entire executive team to plead their case in person. He thought he could use his charisma and his overwhelming corporate presence to intimidate the board into submission. Celeste granted the request. She scheduled the final hearing for the following morning. The trap was set, the audience was gathered, and we were walking into a room from which absolutely no one would emerge unchanged. The main auditorium of the Crown Bridge Civic Response Authority was not a boardroom. It was an amphitheater built for public reckonings. The lighting was impossibly harsh, offering absolutely zero shadows for anyone to hide within. The seating arrangement was aggressively hierarchical. The entire Crown Bridge Board of Directors, the independent municipal auditors, and the senior representatives from the underwriting conglomerate sat at a massive, elevated semicircular desk. Down in the well of the room, seated at a remarkably small, exposed table, sat the Northbriar executive team. Reed Holloway, Mercer Dane, and Sloan Holloway were flanked by a small army of highly paid crisis management lawyers. Sloan had abandoned her brilliant ivory dresses and diamonds for a muted, desperately conservative charcoal suit. Reed sat with his hands steepled in front of him, attempting to project the quiet, unshakable confidence of a seasoned chief executive. Mercer looked physically ill, his skin a pale, waxy gray under the fluorescent glare. I stood alone at the presenter's podium, directly facing the elevated board. My encrypted tablet was hardwired into the massive projection screen suspended behind the Northbriar delegation. Celeste Rowan struck her wooden gavel against a sound block, a sharp, violent crack that instantly killed the low murmur of the room. She formally opened the Emergency Procurement Tribunal and offered the floor to the vendor for a preliminary defense. Reed stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket, cleared his throat, and deployed his most resonant, soothing baritone. His strategy was immediately obvious. He needed to build a massive, impenetrable wall between the technical reality of his company and the behavior of his wife. "Madam Chairwoman, members of the board," Reed began, offering a respectful nod. "We are here today because of a profoundly unfortunate social incident. A regrettable lapse in executive hospitality occurred, driven by the intense, high-stakes pressure of a major municipal closing. We have offered our deepest, unreserved apologies for that friction. However, we must not let a fleeting interpersonal misunderstanding blind us to the foundational strength of this partnership. The infrastructure we have built is commercially sound. The technology is robust. I urge this committee to separate a momentary lapse in etiquette from the $80 million technological triumph sitting on the table." He sat down, looking reasonably satisfied. He had painted me as a disgruntled employee holding a petty grudge, and himself as the pragmatic adult trying to save a city project. Celeste did not acknowledge his speech. She simply shifted her dark eyes down to me and nodded. I engaged the microphone on my podium. I did not raise my voice. I did not speak of apologies, feelings, or respect. I spoke exclusively in the cold, unforgiving language of chronological data. "Let us examine this commercially sound partnership minute by minute," I said, tapping the screen of my tablet. The massive display behind Reed flashed to life. It showed a stark, undeniable timeline, stamped with verified digital clock sequences. At exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, the primary cooling architecture at the northern relay station suffered a catastrophic overload, I stated, advancing the slide to show the raw, red-lined thermal variance logs. 17 minutes later, the secondary power array entirely collapsed. This is not an interpersonal misunderstanding. This is a total documented system failure. I tapped the screen again. The timeline moved forward to 8:30 in the morning. The screen split. On the left was the authentic, failed system data from the bunker. On the right was the vibrant, flawless chart Mercer Dane had projected in the boardroom. At 8:30, the executive team knowingly bypassed the live telemetry. I continued, my voice echoing off the acoustic panels of the auditorium. They replaced a critical failure alert with an archived dashboard that concealed the real-time collapse. This is not a lapse in hospitality. This is active, premeditated data manipulation. I advanced the timeline to 9 o'clock in the morning. The screen changed to the high-definition security photograph of Sloane's designer handbag resting on the boardroom floor, the silver visitor badge glaringly visible. Next to it appeared the cropped image of the polished mahogany table, showcasing the glaringly empty expanse of wood where my nameplate should have been. At 9 o'clock, a civilian with zero legal authority, zero security clearance, and a direct, undisclosed financial tie to your subcontractor's supply chain was permitted to dictate warranty terms during a closed government session, I said, letting the words hang in the freezing air. Simultaneously, the physical presence of the sole authorized municipal approver was actively erased from the room. I stepped away from the podium, moving closer to the North Briar table. I looked directly at the legal team sweating beside Reed. I asked this board to stop looking at these events as isolated, harmless fragments, I demanded, projecting my voice to reach the highest tier of the room. Look at the complete architecture. You remove the nameplate, you install a shadow authority, you project falsified data, and you attempt to force a ceremonial signing precisely when you calculate the only person who can stop you will be miles away. You did not build a functioning emergency network. You built an environment designed specifically to close an $80 million contract before the truth could walk through the door. Down at the North Briar table, the pressure finally shattered the thinnest piece of glass. Sloane Holloway could not endure the clinical, public dissection. She was entirely unaccustomed to sitting in a room where her wealth and her husband's title offered absolutely no protection. Her face flushed a deep, furious crimson. She slammed her hands flat against the table and leaned toward my podium, completely ignoring the frantic, whispered warnings of the defense attorney sitting beside her. "I was helping you," Sloane shouted, her voice shrill and echoing wildly in the cavernous space. Someone had to take control. I was stepping in to help people with fancy titles who simply did not have the actual guts to close the deal and get the job done. The entire auditorium went dead silent. The North Briar lead counsel actually dropped his pen and buried his face in his hands. In her desperate attempt to assert her superiority, Sloane had just screamed a fully unprompted, legally binding confession into a public microphone. She had proudly admitted to actively interfering with a state procurement process, confirming her unauthorized role as the shadow closer. Mercer Dane realized the ship was rapidly sinking and made a desperate, final attempt to secure a lifeboat for himself. He grabbed his microphone, his hands visibly shaking. The executive team had absolutely no knowledge of the dashboard switch, Mercer stammered, his polished corporate veneer completely dissolved. That was a tragic, panicked misinterpretation of protocol by the low-level field staff. We would never authorize the suppression of a critical failure report. I walked back to my podium. I did not argue with him. I simply pressed the final button on my tablet. The screen behind them shifted to display the sworn, notarized affidavits from the night shift supervisor and the junior technician. Beside the text documents, an audio file began to play. It was the digitally recovered voicemail Mercer had left on the secure server at the relay station. His own voice, arrogant and commanding, boomed through the auditorium speakers. "Wipe the active logs. Revert the visual display to yesterday's baseline. Hold the official failure report until after the 4 o'clock press release goes live. If that deal dies today, you are all looking for new jobs tomorrow." Mercer Dane physically shrank into his chair. He closed his eyes, entirely defeated by his own recorded arrogance. A profound, heavy realization washed over the elevated board of directors. I watched the faces of the municipal auditors and the financial underwriters harden into absolute stone. They finally saw the entire terrifying matrix. They realized how incredibly close the city had come to handing the keys of its emergency infrastructure over to a roomful of polished frauds. They understood that the core issue had never been about a CEO's wife calling a director a janitor. The core issue was that Northbriar had spent months pouring concrete over a rotten foundation, hoping the city would buy the building before the walls caved in. Celeste Rowan leaned forward. She rested her forearms on the elevated desk and looked down into the well of the room. She did not look at Reed Holloway. She did not look at his lawyers or his wife. She looked entirely and exclusively at me. The auditorium held its collective breath. The air in the room felt heavy enough to make breathing work. "Director Gray," Celeste said. Her voice was not loud, but it commanded absolute authority, cutting through the heavy silence like a blade. She paused, ensuring every single person in the room was hanging on her next words. With the complete, unvarnished file now fully present before this board, Celeste asked, delivering the heaviest question of the entire session. "Do you, as the Director of Integration Assurance, assess that this contract can still be saved?" I kept my hands resting lightly on the edges of the podium. I lifted my chin and looked straight up at her. The silence stretched, tight and absolute, hovering right on the jagged edge of the final drop. I pushed my chair back from the presenter's podium. The scrape of the wooden legs against the auditorium floor sounded like a sharp gunshot in the heavy, suffocating silence. I did not reach for the microphone. I did not need artificial amplification. The pure, terrified quiet radiating from the Northbriar delegation ensured that every single syllable I spoke would carry all the way to the highest tier of the room. "Madam Chairwoman," I began, locking eyes with Celeste before panning my gaze across the entire elevated board of directors. Under Section 7 of our Standardized Procurement Guidelines, specifically the clauses governing vendor integrity, authority segregation, and false readiness representation, the purchasing authority relies on absolute unvarnished transparency. I turned my head slightly, letting my eyes drop down to the miserable, pale faces sitting at the Northbriar table. We do not pause a public infrastructure initiative when a vendor actively falsifies thermal variance logs to hide a total system blackout. We do not ask for a personnel addendum when a civilian is permitted to override municipal warranty terms. And we absolutely do not engage in a renegotiation when a chief operating officer explicitly threatens his own engineering staff to suppress critical failure data. I gripped the edges of the podium, leaning forward just a fraction of an inch. "Therefore, I am stating this for the official, permanent municipal record," I said, my voice dropping into a register of absolute, unbreakable finality. "This is not a temporary suspension of activities. This is not a request for a revised deployment timeline, and this is certainly not an invitation for a financial concession. Effective immediately, I am exercising my unilateral authority as the Director of Integration Assurance to entirely cancel the $80 million infrastructure contract with Northbriar Signal Systems." Reed Holloway's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The polished, imperial executive facade completely shattered, leaving behind nothing but the hollow, panicked expression of a man who just watched his entire legacy vaporize into the freezing air. Beside him, Mercer Dane buried his face in his trembling hands, entirely incapable of looking up at the board. Sloane Holloway simply sat frozen, her manicured nails digging so hard into the wooden table that her knuckles turned a stark, absolute white. The ceremonial documents they had so proudly signed the previous morning, the thick, expensive linen paper they had smiled over for the public relations cameras, instantly metamorphosed into worthless scraps of pulp. Without my specific cryptographic launch code, those signatures were nothing more than incredibly expensive graffiti. Up on the elevated dais, the senior representative from the insurance conglomerate did not say a single word. He simply reached out, closed his thick leather portfolio with a heavy, dismissive snap, stood up, and walked out of the auditorium. That single, silent action was the final nail in the coffin. The completion bond was dead. Northbrier's financial lifeline was officially severed. To prevent the city from falling into a dangerous vulnerability gap due to Northbrier's deceit, our procurement team immediately submitted the pre-drafted contingency protocol. We initiated a rapid, highly vetted rebidding process while simultaneously executing a 12-month temporary maintenance bridge contract with our legacy provider. The Civic emergency grid would remain online, protected by older but fundamentally honest technology, rather than a shiny $80 million lie. The dismantling of Northbrier's leadership happened with breathtaking, ruthless speed. By nightfall, Reed Holloway's illusion of absolute control had entirely evaporated. The Northbrier Board of Directors convened an emergency session over an encrypted video link. Faced with the catastrophic public loss of their flagship municipal contract, the immediate withdrawal of their underwriters, and the impending tsunami of state litigation, they did what corporate boards always do. They severed the diseased limb to save the host. Reed was stripped of his chief executive title and forcibly removed from the board within 6 hours. He had allowed his arrogant marriage to violently eclipse his fiduciary duty, and the corporate market punished him with immediate, irreversible exile. Mercer Dane did not even make it back to his corner office to collect his personal belongings. Building security intercepted him in the main lobby, confiscated his electronic access cards, and escorted him directly to the sidewalk in front of dozens of his own employees. He was placed on immediate unpaid administrative suspension, but losing his prestigious job was the absolute least of his problems. The recovered emails and audio recordings he had sent to the Northern Relay Station became the primary kindling for a massive, multi-agency federal investigation into corporate fraud and data concealment. His desperate attempt to save a press release was now threatening to cost him his freedom. As for Sloane Holloway, her punishment was uniquely tailored to destroy the only currency she truly valued: her social and corporate access. A formal trespass notice was issued by the new interim executive team, legally barring her from ever stepping foot inside any Northbrier facility nationwide. Her days of playing the untouchable corporate queen, clearing out boardrooms and throwing tissue boxes at people she deemed beneath her, were permanently terminated. More devastatingly, the forensic financial audit regarding her boutique consulting firm was handed directly over to the state attorney general. The monthly payments she had quietly siphoned from the hardware subcontractor opened a sprawling, highly dangerous civil investigation into corporate kickbacks and illegal self-dealing. She had demanded I clean up a spilled coffee, entirely unaware she was leaving a massive, glaring trail of financial corruption right to her own front door. Several weeks later, the intense storm of the tribunal had somewhat normalized into the tedious, everyday rhythm of legal depositions and new vendor interviews. I was walking through the upper levels of the Crownbridge Administrative Annex, carrying a thick stack of revised technical specifications. I passed by one of our own executive conference rooms. The heavy glass doors were propped wide open. Inside, the morning light caught the gleaming surface of a freshly polished stone floor. In the corner of the room, a member of the building maintenance staff was quietly organizing a utility cart, placing a damp string mop into a yellow bucket. The faint, sharp scent of industrial cleaner hung in the air. I stopped in the hallway for a moment, watching the simple, honest labor. I remembered the heavy, rough wood of the mop handle I had gripped in the Northbrier boardroom. I remembered the burning, acidic humiliation I had forced myself to swallow, compressing it tightly into a cold, calculated weapon. Standing there, I realized a bitter but incredibly beautiful truth. In any complex architecture, whether it is a physical skyscraper or a multi-million-dollar corporate ecosystem, there will always be messes that require tending. There are people whose job it is to clean the superficial stains off the floor, to make the surface look presentable for the cameras. And then there are people who have to dig much deeper, who have to wade into the subterranean trenches to clean out the toxic, rotting corruption hiding deep within the system itself. I adjusted the heavy files in my arms, a quiet, genuine smile touching my face. On that specific Tuesday in Uptown Charlotte, they had arrogantly mistaken me for the former. They had absolutely no idea I was perfectly capable of doing both. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please leave a comment letting me know where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts together. And I invite you to subscribe to the Boss Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by even more people.